Hello, my friends. William here on the 24th of November, 2025. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series, and we have a bit of a poison pen letter to England today, if I can put it that way. So let's dive into the recap. We're still doing the long diary entry of the 19th of October. So this is the penultimate section of that. In the last section, Dmitri was discussing primarily two things: the defense of Petrograd from the German Navy, actually, through the Gulf of Finland, and the Italian catastrophe, so the Battle of Caporetto, I think it was called, where the Italian army was just routed. And it didn't end their participation in the war, as was anticipated in the aftermath, but it was still disastrous. And the whole thing about that, and the reason why Dmitri was paying so much attention to it, was that there was a sense that it was Russia's fault, because the war effort was grinding down. It hadn't stopped yet in Russia, and with the collapse of the Italian army, or the seeming collapse, the Germans and Austrians would be able to reallocate troops to the Western Front, where they were badly needed with what was going on in Russia. And then the Italian collapse, that would be a great boon to the Central Powers. Okay, so in today's section, there are two places where I don't quite understand what he's saying. So, it's diary writing. You don't take time to make sure everything is completely clear, as you would if you were writing an essay or something like that. One is where he refers to stocks, as in, the financial term, shares, stocks. And the other one is where he talks about financial clutches, and neither of those seem quite right to me, so you'll know when we get there. Okay, let's get going with a warning in advance to English, British viewers that Dmitri is quite emotional and quite negative, talking about Great Britain. Okay, here we go. I often catch myself thinking that if the English are punished, it will only make me happy. Recently, I have begun to notice that the English are pursuing power everywhere. That's probably always been the case, but it's now become more obvious. Of course, they rejoice at our revolution and our weakness. Often, I even get that from Marling's words. They were certain that, even without Russia, but with the help of America, they could win. And then, of course, Russia would sink into complete slavery and abasement, and England would grow enormously stronger. If we hadn't had a revolution and we had triumphed, Russia would have become a dangerous and powerful country. If now in England, France, and Italy, but mainly in England, unrest grows that weakens her, Russian stocks will increase significantly. The politics of England über alles are as strong with her as with Germany. That is everywhere apparent. I think the main reason for England's non-interference in our revolution was precisely the motive of letting Russia disintegrate and destroy herself. We no longer need her services because we have a new ally, America, who can be more useful than the Russian troops. But now there's a new factor, and it seems to me that England, with her lust for power, will have to think hard and seriously about the development of her foe's success on the Italian front. On that topic, I will go further still and say that after this war, our future foe will certainly be England, because our interests clash with hers in many more places than even with Germany. For example, in Persia, in the Far East, in the East, etc. One cannot, of course, shut one's eyes to the fact that after the war, German goods will come to us in greater quantities than English, and it doesn't matter at all whose financial clutches fall into. Now all the southern routes are taken by the English. What does that mean? That it will be their zone of influence like southern Persia, and nothing is said about reciprocal relations between England and Russia in Persia. They have already begun to fall apart. Of course, one must logically expect that the attitude toward Russia as toward a country going through a terrible crisis has undeniably changed. Our voice will be less authoritative and much less consideration will be given to our wishes. Okay, there's so much to unpack here. First of all, our friend has a real chip on his shoulder and will continue to have in relation to the West, but more specifically England. And in Dmitri's case, it's not the sort of Slavophile view of things that, the West is corrupt, modernization is undesirable. No, he didn't believe those things. It's geopolitical. It's the dream of the Russian great power. And that's why England, which seems to be at the moment, at least to Dmitri, in Europe, the great power, he doesn't have much to say about the U.S. That's why England is so threatening and on such an emotional level. And this kind of places him with the progressive, the professional part of the Russian military. They were the ones that had this idea that their personal honor was invested, their personal pride and honor were invested in Russia's success or failure as a great power. And that was, that was why so many of the general staff officers insisted on Nicholas II's abdication, because the dynasty was one thing, the Russia's great power status was another. And so, we see that Dmitri very much was simpatico with that mindset. Okay, it almost is tinged with paranoia here. But, he's emotionally upset. I don't know what happened in particular that set him off, if it was something that Sir Charles said or something like that. But he would continue in immigration to be very sensitive to any hint that the British considered themselves better than Russians across the board. Okay, his use of language is always of great interest to me, as it appears throughout the whole scope of his diaries and his correspondence. And you notice right away in the first sentence here that he uses the word punished. If the English are punished, it will make me happy. So shame and punishment are two things that are everywhere in Dmitri's writing. And I wonder if that goes back to Sergei. I don't know, it's speculation, but from the standpoint of text analysis, it's very interesting. Okay, and here he says, recently I have begun to notice that the English are pursuing power everywhere. So, what is it? Is it the war news overall? I'm not sure exactly where England stood in the war effort just at that moment, or was it something that Sir Charles or one of the other English diplomats at the legation said? I don't know, but something set him off. So here, again, another use of language that's very interesting. Slavery and abasement. It's not just that England will be, a lesser country compared to England. It's that Russia would sink into complete slavery and abasement. So those are interesting words. Russia will, be weak, that sort of thing. Okay, but slavery and abasement, whose slave will they be? And, what abasement? Russians will not be able to hold up their head in the world. I don't think this is just Dmitri. Maybe I shouldn't speculate, but I think it's still an issue with Russians. We may look and think, we're stronger. We have the more functional society. Russians are thinking it in terms of they look at us as dirt. Okay, so that's too bad. Stocks, yeah, this allusion to stocks. I'm not quite sure what he means by this. It's kind of an odd thing to go from, from the talk about the geopolitical situation to stocks. I don't know. Maybe Dmitri had investments, probably had investments, but not abroad, because he didn't have money outside of Russia that he was able to use. Okay, England über alles. Wow, that's really getting down and dirty, isn't it? So already, we think of this in terms of the Second World War, this Deutschland über alles. But apparently, at this time, during the First World War, there was also this understanding that it wasn't just that Germany wanted to be an empire and have, geopolitical success versus the other countries, but that Germany wanted to rule the world. And now he's saying, well, maybe it is as strong it is as much England that wants to rule the world as Germany. And I suppose, you could say, well, imperial powers in general want to grab territory and resources. But, for Dmitri to put it that way, and again, it's something that you see with Russians after the revolution. Who's our friend? Who's our friend going to be in the future? We feel, it's a kind of defense, because they felt ashamed, or Dmitri felt ashamed, and I think other Russian emigres felt ashamed that they didn't feel like they could really rebut the accusations coming from the Allies that Russia had betrayed the Allies. And so instead, they took this defensive posture and said, well, maybe we'll be friends with Germany instead of you. Whereas during the war, the anti-German sentiment in Russia had been, super strong, as elsewhere in the Allied countries. All right, let's see. Another interesting use of words, lust for power. So this is very personal. It's not just, well, here's the situation. It's personal. It's not just that they, like every other imperial power, want more and more and more. It's lust for power. Okay. And Dmitri, as we've talked about before, is right here at sort of ground zero in the great game. That before the war, this rivalry in the East between Britain and Russia. I mean, Kipling's novel Kim is about that. An excellent first-rate novel to read if you want to dive into the sort of great game situation. And specifically in England, or in Persia, Persia had been more or less divided into zones of interest. Russia's was in the north, and there were Russian troops in the north. England's was in the south, which happened to be where the oil fields were, although it wasn't so important. Before the revolution, the idea of the oil fields was not nearly as important as it would become later. And again, Dmitri is there at ground zero. He says that reciprocal relations between Russia and Britain are falling apart in Persia. Was that true? I don't know. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a mystery because we don't obviously, as I said at the beginning, something had set Dmitri off, had felt very personal to him. And we don't know what it was, and so we don't know what precisely is beneath this perception of his that reciprocal relations between Britain and Russia were falling apart in Persia. He's still not going to leave the British legation, unless Baratov absolutely orders him to, and says this is an order, and then he would have. But even though he's so offended at Britain and sees relations between the Russians and the British falling apart, he's still not going to leave the British legation. So make what you will of that. Okay, so what do we have next time? Well, more tension, and this time on a personal level rather than a geopolitical level, specifically with Lucia Marling, with Lady Marling, and bringing Sir Charles into it, and around this issue of what is his relationship with Lady Marling. Are they, are they an item? Are they not? Yeah, obviously, as he wrote this part of the long diary entry of the 19th, he was not in a good state of mind, but and not in the next installment either, but we're with him through thick and thin here with the diaries. So I hope to see you next time. Bye.